All right, this is a bit of a lecture or an addendum to the lecture on intertextuality. I wanted to talk a little bit about how intertexts play into our interpretation of two separate passages, one being the Luke and Lord's Supper account, the other being Hebrews chapter 3, and the example of the disobedience of the Exodus generation. So let's take a look, first of all, at Luke 22. And some of these things are mentioned in your handout, and I just want to walk through a little bit with you. A couple things about the Luke passage that I want to just talk about intertext. One of the things that's mentioned when Jesus shows up in Luke 22:15, he says, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." And the mention of the Passover is alluded to in Luke, or in Matthew and Mark. In Luke, he's going to make a pretty significant, he's going to make this explicit. This Passover meal is being used. So this is an intertext that Luke wants his readers to connect. This Passover, this meal that's being eaten is a Passover meal. And so when we get down here to the cup, this cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. I want to say a couple things about this. In light of the Passover motif, the idea of the blood, that is the cup being blood, is likely an allusion to Exodus chapter 12 and the killing of the Passover lamb, and then the blood being put on the doorposts to accomplish a couple things, to accomplish protection from the angel that's coming over, as well as to accomplish ultimate deliverance out of slavery. So when we're asking questions, why are these intertexts important? When we're asking questions about what the meaning of the passage is, Luke is using an intertext to help provide that meaning. And so the blood of the Passover lamb of Exodus 12 accomplishes protection and deliverance. Another intertext that we might see here is the phraseology of the blood of the covenant. The blood of the covenant seems to be an allusion also to the Exodus generation, but not at the Passover, but more at Mount Sinai. In Exodus 24, you have a phrase, the blood of the covenant. And that blood of the covenant is not blood that is accomplishing deliverance as much as it is blood that is accomplishing a establishment of the covenant. So Moses kills 2 oxen, he takes half of the blood, he pours it out on the altar, he splashes it on the altar, but then he takes the rest of the blood after reading the law and the Torah to the people, and he takes the blood and he splashes it all over the people. He sprinkles the people. And this accomplishes this idea of mutual obligation, God to his people, God's people to him, to be obedient, to be faithful. So what is the blood of the covenant accomplishing here? In Exodus 12, that blood is accomplishing protection and deliverance. Here the blood is accomplishing the establishment of a covenant. You also read the idea of the new covenant. This is also an intertext, an allusion to Jeremiah 31, where we have the idea that in those days God says, "I will establish a new covenant and I will forgive their sins." And so in this case, the establishment of the covenant also, and the blood of the covenant, produces the forgiveness of sins. You might also, you look out here in Luke 22:20, it says that the cup which is poured out for you. In Mark and Matthew, it says it's poured out for many, which is likely an allusion to Isaiah 53. So just in this one phrase, we have an allusion to 4 different texts. We have 4 different intertexts in this one phrase, which is trying to pack the idea of the meaning of the Lord's Supper and the blood of the Lord's Supper to what is being accomplished, what Jesus and what Luke is trying to accomplish in his text. So that's one example of intertext. Let's look at another example in Hebrews chapter 3. Go back up here to this. One of the things about the intertext in Hebrews chapter 3, Hebrews 3, 7 to 4, 12, is an exposition on the Exodus generation. But one important thing here is we don't just have an allusion to a text, we actually have a quotation of a text. This is a quotation of Psalm 95. In the Septuagint, this is Psalm 94, and it seems to follow the Septuagint pattern. Here, Psalm 95, in the Masoretic text, it talks about hardening your hearts in Meribah, which is an occasion in earlier Numbers 14. But here it talks about them hardening their hearts as in the day when they provoked me, the day of trial in the wilderness. And what seems to be happening here is that though the Exodus generation on a whole is being alluded to in Hebrews, the more specific example of their disobedience is being alluded to at the episode of the 12 spies. And so this is going to be, what we're going to see is after the quotation of Psalm 95, 94 in the Septuagint, the author is going to then talk about, okay, who provoked him when they had heard? All those who came out of Egypt, those who he was angry with for 40 years, those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness. Now, this idea of 40 years, bodies falling in the wilderness, is echoing the language of Numbers chapter 14. And Numbers 14 is immediately following the episode of the 12 spies and the disobedience of the nation, and it produces a significant response of God, a final response, a finality in this sense. So there's a number of things, and also the idea of the swearing of the oath, that happens in Numbers 14 as well. You might also look at Deuteronomy 1, 19 through 46, but both of these passages refer to events surrounding the episode of the 12 spies and the people's rebellion against Joshua and Moses. So that is the specific image that's being called to mind here in Hebrews. One other intertext that we see in this passage that is significant as we interpret it is when in Hebrews 4:3 it talks about those who believed enter rest. Just as it is written, I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Now, one of the things that happens here is that in Numbers 14 as well as Deuteronomy 1, there's the idea that the Exodus generation is trying to enter into the land. The author of Hebrews is going to make something of a bold switch here. Rather than entering into land, is going to be entering into rest. And so the idea of salvation in Hebrews is the idea of entering into rest. And he's going to then allude back. His works were finished from the foundation of the world, which is an allusion to Genesis chapter 2, Genesis 2:2. And then he quotes Genesis 2:2. God rested on the seventh day from all his works. So this idea of not entering into the land is now going to be moved over to not entering into rest. And we have a significant shift of meaning that the author of Hebrews is trying to do by quoting from Old Testament passages and alluding to that. So hopefully this is helpful when we talk about what is an author meaning, how is an author using other texts to provide, to bring meaning into this. In this case, the idea is he's talking about a significant disobedience that produces a finality of disobedience, a finality of consequences, and talking about the audience of Hebrews now standing on a similar position, and what are they going to do in terms of entering into not just the land, but to enter into the rest of God. How is that going to work? So hopefully this is helpful in light of the PDF on Intertext, but read that, look at this alongside of that, and this should be somewhat helpful as some test cases of how intertexts play into New Testament and biblical interpretation.